The monitors said he was dying, and not one of the men in that room could tell you why. It was past 3 in the morning on the 4th floor of Meridian Crest Medical Center, and the most expensive private suite in the building held a man worth more than the hospital that was failing to save him. Conrad Whitfield, 61 years old, founder of a logistics empire that moved a third of the produce in 3 states, lay ashen against white sheets with a tube down his throat and a number on the screen that kept falling. His blood pressure would not hold, his kidneys were shutting down, his fever burned through every antibiotic they hung, and his own body seemed to be turning on itself from the inside. 11 days, 47 physicians, specialists flown in from 2 coasts, consultants who billed by the quarter hour, a chief of medicine who had not lost a high-profile patient in 19 years and did not intend to start now. They had run every test the building owned. They had named his condition 6 different things and treated all 6, and the man kept sinking. Nadine Esperanza stood at the foot of that bed in laundered grey scrubs, holding a clipboard that nobody at the bedside had asked her to hold. She was the night shift charge nurse for the unit. She was not a doctor. In the geography of that room, she was the smallest figure present, and everyone in it had arranged themselves so that she stayed that way. She was about to ask one question. It would take her 4 seconds to say it, and it would do what 11 days and 47 trained physicians could not. Before you hear the question, you need to understand the woman asking it, and you need to understand the 11 days that built the walls she was about to walk through. So let me take you back to the morning. The old man first came through the doors when nobody knew his name yet, and the woman who would save him was 3 floors down, helping a frightened old woman in bed, 12 drink a cup of water. She could not hold steady on her own. Nadine was 43 years old. She had been a nurse for 21 years, the last 9 of them at Meridian Crest, and before that in a county hospital where the waiting room never emptied and the supply closet was always 1 box short of what you needed. She had learned medicine in rooms where there was no consultant to fly in. She had learned it the way you learn a language, by being dropped into the country with no dictionary, where every mistake costs something and nobody slows down to explain. She worked nights by choice. The night was honest. At night, the administrators were home, the visitors were gone, and what was left in a hospital was the truth of who was getting better and who was not. Nadine read that truth the way other people read a newspaper. She would walk a unit at the start of her shift, and she would know, before she opened a single chart, which 3 patients she needed to watch and which one she needed to never take her eyes off. She had learned that from her grandmother. Her grandmother had not been a nurse. Her grandmother had been a sitter. The woman families paid a few dollars a night to stay in a sick room and simply watch over someone who could not be left alone. She could not read a monitor. She had never touched one. What she could do was walk into a room where a person lay sleeping and tell you, inside of a minute, whether that person was mending or quietly making their way toward the door, and she was right more often than the men who came through twice a day with their clipboards and their certainty. Nadine had asked her once, as a girl, how she knew. They were in the kitchen, the small one that always smelled of evaporated milk and bay leaf, and her grandmother had been peeling a potato over a chipped enamel bowl. The old woman set the knife down. She wiped her hands on her apron and thought about it the way she thought about everything, slowly, as though the answer were a stitch she did not want to drop. Then she said that a sick body never stops trying to tell you what is wrong with it. It will tell you with the color of a lip, she said, with the way a hand lies open or closed, with whether a person turns toward the window or away from it. The trouble, she said, is not that the body goes quiet. The trouble is that most people in the room are too busy being right to hear it. She had taken Nadine to a few of those sick rooms over the years, a girl of 9 and then 12 and then 15 sitting in a hard chair in the corner, while her grandmother watched over a neighbour's dying husband or a deacon's failing mother. Nadine had learned in those chairs to sit still for hours and to look. She had learned that the most important thing in a sick room is often the thing nobody has written down, because nobody thought to ask the person who knew. That sentence shaped everything Nadine became. She listened. She listened to the things that were not words, the small grammar of a body in trouble, the way a hand drifts or a breath catches or a person turns their face from the light. She had saved more lives with that listening than with anything they had taught her in school. and she had never once told a doctor that was how she did it, because she had learned early what happened to a woman in a plain laundered uniform who tried to teach a man in a white coat something he had decided he already knew. Conrad arrived on a Tuesday, brought in by his own driver because he had collapsed in the back of his car on the way to an airfield. By the time he reached Meridian Crest, he was burning with fever and barely making sense, and within the hour the hospital understood exactly who it had. The administrator came down in a tie at 5 in the morning. The good suite was cleared. The phones began to ring. The man who took the case was Dr. Bertrand Call, Chief of Medicine, 58 years old, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead and a reputation that arrived in a room before he did. He was, by any honest measure, brilliant. He had built the cardiac program that put Meridian Crest on the map. He had a way of standing at the foot of a bed with his arms folded that told everyone present the thinking was finished and only the execution remained. He looked at the man in the bed, ordered a battery of tests, and named the problem, with a confidence that calmed the entire floor. Sepsis from an abdominal source, he said. Find the source, drain it, flood him with antibiotics, and he will turn the corner in 72 hours. He was wrong. He was wrong in a way that took 11 days to prove, because everything he did was reasonable. And reasonable is the hardest kind of wrong to catch. They scanned the man's abdomen and found nothing to drain. They changed the antibiotics, then changed them again, cycling through the broad and the narrow and the last resort, hanging bag after bag, while the fever laughed at all of them. A specialist in infectious disease flew in on the third day, a precise woman with a rolling case of reference books, and she ordered cultures of his blood and his urine and the fluid around his lungs, and every one of them grew nothing. On the fifth day, a kidney consultant arrived and put Conrad on a filtering machine to do the work his own kidneys had quietly stopped doing, and the machine hummed in the corner of the suite like a second patient. On the seventh day, a hematologist studied the way the man's blood was breaking itself apart and used a word in a low voice that made the administrator step out and close the door behind him. Each consultant came, named a piece of the elephant, treated that piece, and left for an airport. None of them stayed long enough to watch the fever curve over 3 nights the way a nurse watches it. None of them bathed the man. None of them could explain why a healthy 61-year-old who walked his own fields had walked into a fever and was now dissolving in a bed that cost more per night than most of the staff made in a week. They had named his condition 6 different things and treated all 6 with skill, and the only thing they had not done was ask the man's life a single question. Nadine watched all of it from the edges because the edges were where they kept her. She had been on the unit every night since the man arrived. She knew his numbers better than the consultants who read them off a screen and flew home. She had turned to him, bathed him, suctioned the tube in his throat, and sat in the quiet hours doing the thing her grandmother taught her, which was to simply look at the human being in the bed and ask what he was trying to say. And by the 4th night, Nadine had begun to suspect that everyone was treating the wrong story. The fevers had a shape. They spiked and broke on a rhythm, and the rhythm was not the rhythm of an infection. His skin, when she bathed him, had a faint bronze cast under the grey that nobody had charted, because nobody bathes a billionaire and writes down the colour of his shoulders. His belly was soft, when it should have been rigid if the chief was right. And there was something about the pattern of which organs were failing, and in what order that sat wrong in her, the way a sentence sits wrong when one word has been swapped for another that sounds the same. She did what she was supposed to do, she told the resident. The resident was a tired young man named Pruitt, who had been awake for 19 of the last 24 hours, and who listened to her with the specific politeness people use when they have already stopped listening. He held his pen, but he wrote nothing down. He told her the consultants had it handled, 3 of the best minds in the region, and that the case was the most watched in the building. He told her, not unkindly with the weariness of a man repeating something he believed, that she should focus on her nursing assessments and leave the differential to the team. He even smiled at her, the small, tired smile of a person who thinks he is being gentle. Nadine heard the wall go up in his voice, brick by brick, the same wall she had heard in 100 voices over 2 decades on the floor, and she did not push against it, because pushing was how you got pulled off a case, and being pulled off the case meant the man in bed 9 lost the one person in the building who was still listening to him. She went back to bed 9 and stood at the foot of it and watched the man breathe, and the number on the screen fell 1 more point. Here is the thing you have to understand about a place like Meridian Crest. The wall that kept Nadine quiet was not built out of one man's arrogance. It was built out of 1,000 small assumptions, each of them reasonable on its own, that added up to a room where the most experienced set of eyes in the building had no standing to speak. She had no title that opened doors. She had no letters after her name. When she walked into a consult, the consultant saw the grey scrubs first and the plastic name badge last, and the uniform told them everything they intended to learn about her before she opened her mouth. On the 9th day, the wall got a name. Dr. Call came onto the unit at the start of Nadine's shift, surrounded by the team, and he stopped at bed 9 to look at the man he was losing. Nadine had been charting 2 beds down. She heard the consult begin, and she made a decision she had made very few times in her whole career. She walked over. She waited for a pause, and into the pause she said carefully that she had been watching the patient's fever curve and his skin and the order his organs were failing in, and she wondered whether anyone had asked about his recent travel, because the picture did not look to her like the kind of infection they were treating it as. The room went still. Dr. Call turned and looked at her the way a man looks at a chair that has spoken. He let the silence stretch a beat so the whole team would understand what was about to happen and learn from it. Then he asked her in a voice pitched for the back of the room how long she had held a medical license. She said she was a registered nurse. He said that he was well aware of what she was, that he had a wall of them at his disposal, and that when he needed a bed turned or a floor mopped, he would be sure to let her know, and that the differential on the most complex case in the building was not improved by speculation from the people who emptied its trash. He said it without heat. That was the worst of it. He said it the way you state a fact about furniture. A resident laughed, once, a short, ugly bark, before he caught himself and studied his shoes. A young nurse near the supply cart looked at the floor and did not look up. The infectious disease specialist on the screen kept her face professionally blank. Dr. Malls! Call had already turned his back to Nadine and was continuing the consult, pointing at the screen as if the chair had stopped speaking, which, for the moment, it had. The whole thing had taken perhaps 20 seconds, and it would have looked like nothing at all to anyone watching from the hallway, which is exactly how the most permanent kind of wall gets built, 20 quiet seconds at a time, in a voice that never once has to raise itself. Nadine stood there 4 seconds longer than was comfortable. Her face did not change. She set the chart she was holding down on the rolling table, squared it to the edge with 2 fingers, and walked back to her station. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She absorbed it the way she had absorbed it 100 times, and she filed it somewhere it would not slow her down, and she went back to work. The young nurse by the supply cart, an older woman named Imani with kind, watchful eyes in the same plain uniform Nadine wore, watched her go and said nothing, but she watched. Call did not know, because he had never asked, was that the woman he had just called, the person who emptied the trash, had spent the 9th and 10th days of his patient's decline doing the one thing nobody on his team had done. She had gone looking for the man's story. She started with the only people who would talk to her, which were the other people in grey. The night shift transport aide, a young man named Divo, who had pushed half the gurneys in the building, remembered the driver who brought Conrad in. A quiet man in a dark coat, he said, who had waited in the family lounge for 2 days without eating much, who had filled the paper cup at the water cooler over and not drunk from it. The driver had said, while he waited, that his boss had been complaining of aches and a strange tiredness ever since the trip, and that he had told one of the doctors so, and the doctor had nodded the way you nod at a man you have already stopped hearing. Nadine asked which trip. Divo did not know. He had only pushed the gurney. He told her, though, that the family lounge kept a sign-in log on a clipboard, chained to the desk by the door, the kind nobody ever reads, and that the driver had signed it twice. The log had the driver's name and a phone number written in careful, block letters by a man who wanted to be reachable. So Nadine, on her own time, on her 30-minute break at 4 in the morning in the stairwell where the signal was best, made a phone call. The driver answered on the fourth ring, wide awake, at 4 in the morning, the way a worried man is awake. His name was Samuel. He was glad someone had called. He had been trying to tell the doctors something for a week, he said, and nobody would take it from a driver, because what does a driver know? Nadine told him she was the night nurse and that she would write down anything he wanted to say, and she heard the man's voice change when he understood that someone, finally, had a pen out and was waiting. 3 weeks before he collapsed, Samuel said, "Mr." Whitfield had gone down to one of the produce operations the company had bought, a place in the River Valley, 2 states south, to walk the fields himself, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who did not trust a thing he had not stood in the middle of. The summer had been wet, there had been standing water across the low ground, and a pump on an irrigation pond had failed, and the old man had rolled up his trousers and waded in himself to look at it because he was impatient and proud. Samuel remembered it clearly. He remembered the brown water to his boss's knees and the cloud of insects over it, and the smell of it. The old man had come up out of the pond with a small cut on his shin from the pump housing, a nothing cut, and he had laughed and put a bandage on it from the glove box and forgotten it. Except the cut had not healed. It had stayed angry and damp for 2 weeks. And then the aches had started, and the tiredness, and 3 weeks to the day after the pond, the man had folded over in the back seat, and Samuel had driven him to Meridian Crest faster than he had ever driven anything. Nadine wrote it all down in the stairwell light. A sore that would not heal. A southern river valley after a wet summer, standing water against bare skin, the bronze cast she had seen under the grey, a fever with a rhythm that broke wrong, kidneys and liver failing in an order that had bothered her for a week. She was not a physician, and she knew the exact edge of what she was allowed to conclude, and she did not cross it. What she knew, the way her grandmother had known, was that the body had been trying to tell them the whole time, and that the answer was not an infection they could grow in a dish on a shelf. It was something the man had carried home in his blood from a place none of the consultants had thought to ask about, because asking would have meant treating the patient as a man with a life and a pond and a Tuesday, and not as a famous riddle to be solved by the cleverest person in the room. She brought it to the resident. Pruitt, again, on the 10th night. This time she did not bring a worry. She brought a page, the driver's account written out in her clean, square hand, the dates laid in a column against the patient's own labs, the pond and the wound set beside the fever curve so that even a man awake for 19 hours could see the shape of it. Pruitt read it standing up under the hallway light. She watched something move behind his exhaustion, a flicker the moment a tired person sees a thing he cannot quite unsee. He said he would mention it to the team in the morning. She knew exactly what mention it meant. She had spent half her life watching good ideas die, in the half-second gap between a nurse saying a thing and a doctor deciding whether a nurse could possibly have said anything worth carrying upstairs. She folded the page and put it back in her pocket, because she had a copy and because she had already decided she was not going to leave it to a man who would mention it. So she did the only thing left to her. She waited for the morning the chief himself would be at the bedside. And she made sure she was there. That morning came on the 11th day, and it came faster than anyone wanted, because at 3:15, the monitor over bed 9 began to scream. Conrad was crashing. His pressure had fallen off a cliff. The night team flooded the room, and within minutes Dr. Call himself arrived, summoned from his bed because a man worth $1.5 billion does not die on a chief of medicine's watch without the chief present to manage it. The room filled with bodies and voices, every one of them doing something correct, and the man in the bed kept sliding toward the place Nadine's grandmother had taught her to recognize from the door. Nadine was already there. She had been there since the alarm. She had positioned herself at the foot of the bed with the driver's account folded in the breast pocket of her uniform, and she watched Dr. Call take command, and she watched him reach even now for the same story he had been telling for 11 days. He called for a broader antibiotic. He called for more pressors. He was treating the infection that was not there harder, because harder was the only direction he had left. And Nadine understood that if she waited for permission, the man would be dead before permission came. So she did not ask for permission. She asked a question. She said it clearly into a gap between two orders in a voice that did not shake. She asked the chief whether anyone had treated the patient for what a man picks up wading in southern standing water with an open wound on his leg 3 weeks before he fell ill. The room did not go silent the way rooms do in stories. It kept moving, hands and voices and the hiss of the machines. Dr. Cole, though, stopped. He turned, and for the first time in 11 days he actually looked at the woman in the plain uniform, and something in his face changed. Because the question was not speculation, and he knew it the instant he heard it. It was a clinical picture: bronze skin, a wound in contaminated water, a fever that broke wrong, organ failure in exactly the order he had been failing to explain. It was a thing he had read about as a young man and had not thought of in years, because it lived in the river valleys of the South and not in the suites of a private hospital, and because the one person who could have told him had been standing in plain sight for 11 days wearing the one thing that had kept him from listening. He could have buried it. That was the moment it could have died, the way her ideas always died, in the space where a man chooses his pride over a patient. Cole stood there with the whole team watching and his certainty cracking, and a lesser man would have ordered her out of the room to save his own face. He did not. He turned to Pruitt and said in a flat, fast voice to send blood for the specific test and to start the specific treatment now before the result came back, because there was no time to wait and the picture was too clean to ignore. Then he asked Nadine one question of his own, quietly. Just to her, he asked her how long she had been sure. She said she had not been sure of anything. She had only been listening. He held her eyes a moment, and then he turned back to the dying man and went to work with everything he had, because the chief of medicine, whatever his sins, was still a doctor when it counted. The treatment was not gentle and it was not instant. It was a hard course of a drug aimed at the thing that had been living and multiplying inside the man's own blood for 3 weeks. And the drug itself was punishing, and for the first full day it looked as if they had found the answer too late to use it. The body that has been dissolving for 11 days does not knit itself back together in an afternoon because someone has finally named the wound. The pressure stayed low. The kidneys stayed silent. The hematologist's words still hung over the bed. Nadine worked that night and the next, and the one after that, double shifts. She did not log, because she would not hand the man off in the hours that mattered to someone who did not know how to listen to him. She turned him every 2 hours. She wet his cracked lips. She talked to him in the low, even voice you use with someone who is far away, telling him the date and the weather, and that his driver Samuel was downstairs and would not leave, telling him to stay. She watched the number on the screen the way her grandmother used to watch a face, the way you watch a horizon for weather, looking for the first thin line of change that means the front has turned. On the 3rd day after the question, the fever broke for the last time. His pressure held without the machines pushing it. His kidneys, which had stopped, made water again, a few drops and then a little more. The small miracle that every nurse on that unit understood and the consultants on 2 coasts had given up on. Conrad opened his eyes on the 5th day after Nadine asked her question, looked at a ceiling he had not expected to see again, and asked in a cracked whisper around a throat roar from the tube who the woman was who kept turning him in the night. He had heard her. In the deep place where the dying still hear, the place a body keeps listening from after the mind has gone quiet, he had heard a calm voice talking to him through all of it, naming the day and the weather, telling him his driver was downstairs and would not leave, telling him to stay. He did not know the face, he knew the voice. And the first thing he wanted, before the lawyers and the board and the empire that had kept running without him, was to know whose it was. Here is where you might expect it to end, with the patient saved and the lesson implied, and everyone going home. The saving of a life, though, is only the stone, and what matters is the water it moves. A hospital is an institution, and an institution does not change because one man lives. It changes only when the people who run it are made to say out loud what happened in front of the people who were in the room. That reckoning came 2 weeks later in a conference room with glass walls on the executive floor, where the administrator had convened what was officially a case review and was, in truth, a careful effort to decide who would be credited. The room filled with suits. The consultants joined by screen from 2 coasts. The chief of medicine sat at the head of the table with his certainty rebuilt and a version of events already assembled, in which the team under his leadership had arrived at the diagnosis through diligent process. Nadine was not invited. She was on the schedule that morning, on the floor, in her laundered uniform, turning a different patient in a different bed, because the work does not stop to attend ceremonies about itself. She was sent for anyway. The person who sent for her was Conrad Whitfield. He had insisted, against his doctor's advice, on attending the review of his own case, and he had arrived in a wheelchair, with an oxygen line still under his nose and the bronze gone from his skin, and the first thing he had done, upon being wheeled into that glass room full of the people who had nearly let him die, was to ask where the night nurse was. The administrator said something smooth about staffing. Conrad Whitfield, who had built an empire by knowing exactly when he was being managed, said he would wait, and he folded his thin hands in his lap, and the highest-ranking people in the building sat in silence, while someone went 2 floors down to find a woman in a maintenance grey uniform and ask her to please come up. She came up still drying her hands. She stood near the door, because the door was where she was used to standing, and she waited to be told why she had been pulled off her unit. The old man asked her to come closer. She crossed the carpet to the edge of that long glass table, the only grey scrubs in a room of charcoal and navy, and she stood with her hands folded the way she always stood. Then, in front of the chief of medicine and the administrator and the consultants on their screens, the old man asked her to tell the room, in her own words, what she had seen and what she had done. Nadine, who had been trained by 21 years and one grandmother never to announce her own competence, did not make a speech. She simply told it plainly, in order, the way she would give report at a shift change. The fever that spiked and broke on a rhythm no infection keeps. The faint bronze under the grey that nobody had charted. The soft belly that should have been rigid. The transport aide who remembered a driver in a dark coat filling a paper cup he never drank from. The sign-in log chained to the desk. The phone call from the stairwell at 4 a.m. The pond after a wet summer. The failed pump. The brown water to a proud man's knees, the small cut from the housing that would not heal, the 3 weeks to the day. The order the organs had failed in, which she laid against his labs without ever once using a word she was not licensed to use. She did not say that anyone had ignored her. She did not say the word trash or the word license or name the morning she had been called a chair. She did not have to. The story said it for her, and the room did the arithmetic on its own. The consultants on the screens looked at their own hands. The administrator's smooth face went still, and the silence that followed was the particular silence of a room full of credentialed people realizing all at once what had nearly been thrown out with the trash, and that it had been standing in plain sight in a working uniform the entire time, asking to be heard. Dr. Cole could have let that silence harden into the version he had walked in with. He chose instead to do the harder thing, and it cost him in front of everyone he had ever stood taller than. He said into the quiet that the diagnosis that saved his patient's life had been made by the nurse at the foot of the bed, and that he had heard her say it 9 days too late, because he had decided in advance there was nothing she could tell him. He said the word he never said, which was that he had been wrong, and that being wrong for 11 days in that bed was the most expensive mistake of his career, and not because of the man it nearly killed. Nobody applauded. This was not a room that applauded. Imani, the older night nurse from the unit, had slipped in at the back to stand with Nadine, and Nadine saw the woman's eyes go bright and her chin lift, and that was the only witness whose reaction Nadine cared about, because Imani knew exactly what it had cost to stand at the foot of that bed and ask that question into that particular room. The institution moved the way institutions move. When a billionaire is watching, there was a new protocol drafted within the month and approved without the usual year of committees that required a structured travel and exposure history on every single admission, taken by nursing at the bedside, written into the chart. and weighted equally with the physician's differential so that no consultant could skip past it on the way to a cleverer answer. It required, in plain language, that somebody ask every patient where they had been and what they had touched, and that the answer be believed. The protocol was named for nothing and nobody, because when they offered to put Nadine's name on it, she asked them not to. She did not want a monument with her name on a wall she would never be invited to stand near. She wanted the next driver in the next lounge, filling a paper cup he never drinks from, to be heard the first time he opened his mouth. Dr. Cole kept his post. The institution was not going to lose its chief of medicine over a case it could quietly call a triumph of the team, and he was, whatever else, a man who saved more people than he failed. He was a different presence on the unit afterward, though he was slower to fold his arms. Twice in the following year, Nadine watched him stop a consult, turn to the nurse standing at the bedside, the one in grey that everyone else looked past, and ask her, before anyone else in the room was allowed to speak, what she had noticed in the night. That was the consequence the story handed him, not a fall, not a headline. A changed habit, performed in front of the same residents who had learned the old one from him. The river that Nadine had moved the chief along with it, and a man being made to ask the question he once mocked is a heavier thing to carry than any disgrace. Conrad went home. Before he left, he asked to be wheeled down to the night unit one last time, off hours, when the administrators were gone and the floor was honest, and he found Nadine at her station, charting under a single lamp. He did not offer her money, because he had taken the measure of her by then, and knew what an insult that would be. He asked her instead the question that had been sitting in him since he woke. He asked her how she had known to ask about the water when 47 doctors had not, and Nadine told him the truth, which was that she had not known anything. She had only refused to stop listening to a man who could not speak because a woman had taught her in a milk and bay leaf kitchen a long time ago that a sick body never stops talking, and that the whole art of it is to be the one person in the room who is not too busy being right to hear. He thought about that a long while. Then he asked if her grandmother was still living so he could thank her. Nadine said she was not. He nodded, and he was quiet, and then he said that he would carry the woman's lesson the rest of the life she had given back to him, and that he intended to be, from now on, a man who listened to the people he had spent 61 years walking past. It was the only thing of value he had to offer her, and they both knew it was the right one. Then he asked his driver to take him home, the same driver who had waited 2 days in that lounge, with the answer in his mouth and no one to take it from him, and as the chair rolled away down the long corridor, the driver leaned down and said something to his employer. Nadine watched them go from her station. She did not feel triumph. Triumph was not the shape of it. What she felt was the particular quiet of a thing set right. The same quiet her grandmother used to carry out of her sick room when the person in the bed had turned the corner and would live. She turned back to her charting under the lamp. There was a patient in bed, 6, whose breathing had changed half an hour ago in a way the night had not yet explained, and she had been listening to it the whole time she watched the old man leave. She picked up her clipboard and went to go and find out what he was trying to say. If you have ever been the most experienced person in a room and the least permitted to speak in it, you already know the weight of that corridor she watched the chair roll down. The question is not whether you know the answer. The question is whether you keep listening anyway in the rooms that have decided in advance there is nothing you could tell them. Stay with that a moment, the way Nadine would before the next bed calls you. And if a story like this one is worth your quiet attention, keep it close and let it remind you to ask the question no one else in the room thought to ask.